The studio was alive with anticipation as J.D. Vance, the newly inaugurated vice president, stepped onto the brightly lit stage of one of America's most-watched talk shows. The atmosphere crackled with tension, not just from the audience, but from the production team itself, who seemed unusually alert, as if bracing for a moment they knew was coming. Vance, fresh from taking his oath of office, exuded a quiet confidence, the kind that comes from a man who has nothing to hide and everything to prove. Yet, as he took his seat across from Marcus Bennett, the host with a reputation for sharp-tongued interrogations and a well-documented liberal stance, it became evident that this would not be a standard interview. While Bennett's producer had assured Vance's team that this would be a fair discussion about the new administration, the glint in Bennett's eyes revealed something entirely different. This was an ambush in the making. The pre-interview pleasantries were rushed and mechanical, a mere formality before the real battle began. Bennett's smile never quite reached his eyes, and his grip on his cue cards was tight, his knuckles turning white, signaling the intensity of the moment. Vance, ever the strategist, sensed the trap before it was sprung. His Marine Corps training had taught him to assess the battlefield, and in this case the battlefield was a television studio. The weapons were words, and the opponent was a journalist determined to control the narrative. As the cameras rolled, Bennett's voice carried an artificial sweetness, his opening question deceptively polite, yet loaded with intent. "Mr. Vice President, let's talk about your remarkable journey from Trump critic to his second-in-command." The audience leaned in, expecting a defensive response, but Vance, unfazed, offered a calm smile. "You know, Marcus, that's actually a perfect place to start," he replied, his voice steady, "because it speaks to something bigger than politics. It speaks to the American capacity for growth and understanding." In that moment, the balance of power subtly shifted, and Bennett, who believed himself in command, realized his carefully planned ambush might not unfold as he had expected. J.D. Vance sat across from Marcus Bennett with an air of unshakable confidence, his posture relaxed yet firm, his eyes steady and focused. He had anticipated this moment, knowing that his past criticisms of Donald Trump would be weaponized against him in an attempt to paint him as a political opportunist. Yet instead of reacting defensively or attempting to justify himself with excuses, he met the question head-on, turning what was meant to be a trap into an opportunity. "You know, Marcus," he said, his voice calm and deliberate, "that's actually a perfect place to start because it speaks to something bigger than politics. It speaks to the American capacity for growth and understanding." His words landed with unexpected weight, immediately disarming the assumption that he would squirm under scrutiny. The audience, expecting hesitation, instead leaned in with curiosity, sensing that this was not going to be the standard back and forth they were used to. Bennett, momentarily thrown off by Vance's poise, tried to regain control, pressing further. "Growth and understanding?" he mocked, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Is that what we're calling it now? Some might argue it's just political convenience." But Vance did not flinch. Instead, he maintained eye contact, his expression unwavering. "You see, Marcus?" he continued, "in America, we cherish the tradition of changing our minds when presented with new information. When I criticized President Trump years ago, I was looking at things through a narrow lens. But then I witnessed something remarkable. I saw his policies begin to help the very people I wrote about in my book. I saw real results, not just rhetoric, and that changed my perspective." His words, spoken without hesitation or apology, turned the attack on its head. Rather than being ashamed of his past views, he framed his transformation as a testament to growth and open-mindedness, qualities that should be celebrated, not condemned. Bennett shifted in his chair, visibly unsettled. He had expected defensiveness, perhaps even a moment of hesitation, but Vance had given him neither. Instead, he had flipped the script, forcing Bennett to confront the idea that true wisdom is not about rigidly holding on to past opinions, but about evolving when faced with new realities. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Vance was not merely surviving the interview, he was controlling it. His ability to remain calm under pressure, to respond with thoughtfulness rather than reaction, was steadily unraveling Bennett's planned ambush. As Marcus Bennett realized his attempts to corner J.D. Vance on political opportunism were failing, he quickly pivoted to a topic he believed would be more controversial: faith in politics. With a carefully measured smirk, he leaned forward and asked, "Let's discuss your recent speech at the National Prayer Breakfast. You spoke about divine guidance in government decisions. Don't you think that's a dangerous mix of church and state?" The tension in the studio became palpable. The audience, initially murmuring, fell into an uneasy silence, sensing that the interview was about to enter deeply divisive territory. But if Bennett expected Vance to stumble, to backpedal, or temper his views to avoid controversy, he was sorely mistaken. Instead, Vance's eyes sparked with quiet determination. This was a challenge he had been expecting. "Divine guidance, Marcus?" he said, leaning slightly forward, his voice steady but firm. "What I actually said was that our founding fathers understood the importance of moral guidance in leadership. They weren't afraid of faith. They were afraid of tyranny." His words hung in the air, reverberating through the studio. A ripple of soft amens could be heard from a few audience members, a subtle but telling sign of where many stood on the issue. Bennett's jaw clenched slightly, but he wasn't finished yet. "Surely," he interjected, "in our modern, diverse society, you must acknowledge that bringing faith into governance alienates those who do not share your beliefs." The phrasing was deliberate, an attempt to paint Vance as exclusionary, out of touch with contemporary values. But Vance, ever prepared, did not let the implication go unchallenged. "Let me finish this thought because it's important," he said, raising a hand to halt the interruption. His tone remained respectful, but there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. "When I took my oath of office, I placed my hand on the Bible, the same way leaders have done throughout our nation's history. Not because we are establishing a state religion, but because we recognize that our rights come from God, not merely from government." A quiet murmur ran through the audience. Bennett's carefully rehearsed lines were losing their impact, and he knew it. Glancing toward his producer, perhaps seeking some form of reassurance, he attempted one final push. "But in a government that serves all people, faith should be private, should it not?" Before he could continue, Vance smoothly cut in. "You know what's interesting, Marcus," he said, tilting his head slightly. "When I was a Marine, nobody questioned our chaplain's presence. Nobody complained when we prayed before missions, because in those moments of truth, even the skeptics understood. There is something deeper than politics." A few heads in the audience nodded. The sentiment was relatable, particularly to those who had served in the military or lived through moments where faith, even in its simplest form, was a source of strength. Bennett's frustration became evident. He had stepped onto ground he thought was solid, only to find it shifting beneath him. What was meant to be a damning critique of faith's role in governance had turned into a powerful reaffirmation of its place in American history and leadership. He looked down at his notes, searching for a way to redirect the conversation, but the damage had already been done. The debate had deepened into something far more significant than he had anticipated. An exploration of values, history, and the moral compass that guided the country's leaders. And in that moment, it was clear that Vance had once again seized control of the discussion. As Marcus Bennett realized his previous attempts to trap J.D. Vance were failing, he shifted his strategy to a more direct and personal attack. Vance's once vocal criticism of Donald Trump. Flipping through his notes, he leaned in and, with a sharp-edged smirk, delivered what he believed to be a knockout question. "Let's talk about your relationship with President Trump," he began. "You once wrote passionately against him. Now you stand by his side as vice president. Some might say you've abandoned your principles for political ambition. How do you explain such a complete reversal?" The question was designed to corner Vance, to force him into either admitting hypocrisy or scrambling for an explanation. But Vance was unfazed. Instead of reacting defensively, he smiled, a small, knowing expression that indicated he had expected this very attack. "That's an interesting question, Marcus," he said smoothly, his voice calm, almost reflective. "Because where I come from, we judge people by their character, not by how well they fit into Washington's expectations." The audience murmured, sensing the weight behind his words. Bennett, determined to push further, scoffed. "Character? Is that what you call this complete reversal? Because to some, it looks like political convenience. But Vance was prepared for this, and rather than shy away, he leaned into the moment. Yes, I did criticize President Trump in the past, he admitted. And you know what takes real character? Admitting when you were wrong, standing up for what you believe in, even when people like you twist it into something else. His words landed with force, not as an excuse, but as a declaration of self-awareness and growth. Bennett, sensing his control slipping again, hurriedly shuffled through his cards and pressed on. Mr. Vice President, you built your reputation as a voice for working-class Americans, yet here you are in an expensive suit defending a billionaire. Don't you see the irony? The temperature in the room seemed to drop as some audience members shifted uncomfortably. But Vance remained unshaken. A slight smile played at the corners of his mouth as he responded. You know what I see, Marcus? I see someone who thinks an expensive suit can change a man's values. Let me tell you something. These values, the ones I learned from my grandmother in Middletown, Ohio, don't change with your zip code or your job title. The statement resonated, striking at the core of the media's tendency to equate financial success with moral compromise. Bennett, growing frustrated, took one final swing. So you expect us to believe your transformation had nothing to do with political ambition? He asked, letting the words hang. That we should just ignore your past criticisms? The trap was set, but Vance stepped around it with precision. What I expect, he said steadily, is for people to judge me not by what I once said, but by what I've done, by the policies we're implementing, by the real change happening in our communities. A ripple of applause spread through the audience. Bennett had tried to frame Vance's shift as betrayal, but Vance had turned it into a testament to wisdom, the ability to learn, evolve, and lead. Once again, the carefully planned ambush had crumbled, and it was Vance who was steering the conversation. Marcus Bennett, growing more frustrated with each failed attempt to put J.D. Vance on the defensive, decided it was time for a more aggressive approach. He leaned forward, his voice laced with sarcasm, as he delivered what he believed to be his most damning accusation yet. So, Mr. Vice President, he said, pausing for effect, are you telling us that your transformation had nothing to do with political ambition? That we should simply ignore your past criticisms of President Trump and just accept that you are now his most loyal supporter? Some might call that being a puppet. The word hit the air like a thrown gauntlet, heavy with accusation. A few audience members audibly gasped, sensing that the interview had reached a critical moment. The insult was clear. Bennett wasn't just questioning Vance's integrity. He was outright branding him as someone who had sacrificed his independence for power. It was the kind of attack designed to elicit either anger or defensiveness, but Vance responded with neither. Instead, he remained perfectly composed, his expression unchanged, his eyes locked onto Bennett's with quiet intensity. Then, with deliberate calm, he said, You know, Marcus, that word, puppet, reveals more about you than it does about me. The studio fell silent. Even Bennett hesitated, thrown off by the unexpected response. Vance continued, his voice steady but edged with steel. In your world, loyalty is something to mock. Standing by someone you respect is a weakness. But let me tell you what I learned as a Marine. You judge a person's character by their actions, not by media narratives. The audience, sensing the shift in momentum, leaned in, waiting for more. I have seen President Trump's character firsthand, Vance pressed on. Not the caricature you and your colleagues have created, but the man who stood up for the forgotten Americans. The man who made policies that helped the people I grew up with. So if you're asking whether I changed my mind after seeing the real impact of his leadership, yes, I did. Because real wisdom isn't about clinging to old opinions just to avoid criticism. It's about having the courage to admit when you were wrong. A murmur of approval rippled through the audience, and for the first time, Bennett looked genuinely unsettled. Desperate to regain control, he tried again. A man of your intellectual background must see the contradiction in supporting someone you once opposed. But Vance was ready. There you go again, Marcus, he said, shaking his head slightly. So focused on contradictions that you're missing the bigger picture. The real contradiction is ignoring what I've seen with my own eyes just to please critics like you." The audience erupted into applause. Bennett had tried to make Vance look weak, but instead, he had only given him the perfect opportunity to prove his strength. As the interview progressed, the dynamic in the studio began to shift. What had started as an attempt to put J.D. Vance on the defensive was now becoming something else entirely, a showcase of his composure, intellect, and ability to turn attacks into strengths. The audience, initially neutral or even skeptical, found themselves drawn to Vance's steady presence, his refusal to be rattled by Marcus Bennett's pointed questions. At first, their reactions were subtle, a few murmurs of agreement, quiet nods when Vance spoke about growth, faith, and loyalty. But as the conversation deepened, so did their engagement. Each time Bennett tried to press him into a corner, Vance emerged stronger, more articulate, more unwavering in his convictions. It was not just what he said, but how he said it, his calm but firm demeanor, his ability to turn hostility into an opportunity to reinforce his principles. The moment that truly signaled the audience's shift came when Bennett accused Vance of being a puppet, an attack designed to paint him as weak, as someone who had sacrificed integrity for power. Instead of recoiling, Vance met the moment with confidence and clarity, explaining that true character was about recognizing leadership when it was real and standing by those who had earned respect through action. The applause that followed wasn't just polite acknowledgement. It was a sign that the audience had begun to side with him. Even those who might have disagreed with him politically could not deny the strength in his words. Bennett, sensing the change, grew visibly uneasy. His usual control over the rhythm of the interview was slipping, and the more he pushed, the more the audience responded, not to him, but to Vance. When Vance spoke about faith and tradition, about respecting those who believed in something greater than themselves, several audience members nodded vigorously, some even voicing agreement aloud. The shift was undeniable. The studio had started as Bennett's domain, but now it belonged to Vance. The audience, once passive observers, had become active participants in his triumph. As the interview continued, it became increasingly clear that Marcus Bennett was losing his grip, not just on the conversation, but on his own credibility. What had started as a carefully planned ambush was now unraveling before his eyes, and the more he pushed, the more it became apparent that his strategy was failing. His sharp-edged questions designed to trap J.D. Vance had instead become opportunities for the vice president to reinforce his convictions, turning each attack into a moment of strength. The audience, once neutral, had begun siding with Vance, and Bennett could feel it. His confidence, once unwavering, began to falter. He started interrupting more frequently, his voice becoming sharper, his composure slipping. He glanced at his producer, perhaps looking for reassurance, but none came. The plan had backfired, and everyone in the room knew it. Desperation crept into his tone as he attempted one final push, trying to reframe Vance's transformation as mere political ambition. But Vance, still calm, still composed, effortlessly dismantled the accusation, making it clear that his evolution was not about power but about learning from experience. The audience responded with another round of applause, further eroding Bennett's authority. He flipped through his cue cards looking for a lifeline, but it was too late. The moment had passed. The more he tried to regain control, the more obvious it became that control had slipped from his grasp entirely. The interview had stopped being about Vance's credibility and had instead become a demonstration of Bennett's failure to challenge a man who refused to be intimidated. And as the realization settled in, so did the weight of his defeat. As the interview neared its conclusion, J.D. Vance knew he had one final opportunity to leave an impact, not just on the studio audience, but on the millions watching at home. He had successfully countered every one of Marcus Bennett's attempts to corner him, not through aggression or defensiveness, but through calm, measured responses that exposed the host's bias and reinforced his own principles. Now, as Bennett scrambled to regain control, Vance seized the moment to deliver a closing statement that would define the entire exchange. Straightening his posture, he looked directly into the camera, ensuring his words reached beyond the studio walls. "What you've witnessed today," he began, his voice steady, "isn't just about one interview. It's about something much bigger. something that goes beyond politics, beyond partisan debates. It's about standing firm in your beliefs, even when others try to shame you into silence. The audience, sensing the significance of his words, listened intently. He continued, his tone unwavering but deeply personal. They thought they could shame me for my faith. They thought they could mock my support for President Trump. They thought they could force me to apologize for believing in traditional values. But here's what they don't understand. These aren't just political positions. These are the principles that built this country. These are the values that sustained America through its hardest times and will continue to guide us forward. A ripple of applause began to spread through the studio, growing louder with each passing second. Even those who may have disagreed with his politics could not deny the strength of his conviction. Bennett, clearly realizing the moment was slipping entirely out of his control, tried to interject, but Vance was undeterred. He turned slightly toward the audience, making his final words personal. To every American who has ever been ridiculed for their faith, mocked for their values, or told they're on the wrong side of history, stand strong, because at the end of the day, character isn't about winning the approval of critics. It's about staying true to what you believe in. The studio erupted into applause, louder than at any point before. Bennett, now completely outmatched, glanced at his producer, who gave him a resigned nod. The interview was over, and it was Vance who had emerged victorious, not through confrontation, but through the undeniable power of conviction and truth. As J.D. Vance rose from his seat, the studio erupted into a standing ovation. What had begun as an orchestrated ambush had transformed into a moment of undeniable triumph for the vice president. The energy in the room had shifted so completely that even the most skeptical audience members found themselves caught up in the wave of applause. Marcus Bennett, still seated, his cue cards now useless in front of him, could do nothing but watch as the moment slipped entirely from his grasp. His carefully planned questions, meant to discredit and humiliate Vance, had instead served as stepping stones for the vice president to demonstrate his resilience, conviction, and ability to rise above the fray. The host's frustration was evident. His usual sharp comebacks had been dulled, his attempts to maintain control reduced to mere interruptions that had been brushed aside with ease. As Vance turned to leave, he paused for one final remark, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who knew he had just won not just an argument, but the respect of many watching. "You see, Marcus," he said, glancing back at the host, "sometimes the strongest answer to bias is truth, and sometimes the best response to arrogance is dignity." His words hung in the air, resonating with the audience in a way that no soundbite or scripted response ever could. Bennett, visibly deflated, had no retort. The moment belonged entirely to Vance. As the cameras faded to black, the impact of the interview was undeniable. This was no ordinary political exchange. It was a defining moment, one that exposed the predictable tactics of media figures like Bennett and reaffirmed the power of unwavering conviction. The American people had just witnessed a rare sight, a leader who refused to apologize for his beliefs, who would not be manipulated into playing defense, and who understood that true strength lies not in outshouting your opponent, but in standing firm when it matters most. And as Vance exited the stage, leaving behind a host grasping for control and an audience still buzzing with admiration, it was clear that this was not just a victory. It was a statement. The interview between J.D. Vance and Marcus Bennett was more than a political confrontation. It was a testament to the power of unwavering conviction, dignity, and wisdom in the face of opposition. For older generations who have witnessed the shifting tides of politics, media narratives, and societal expectations, this moment carries an important lesson. True strength is not found in reacting with anger or defensiveness, but in standing firm with grace and clarity. Life, much like this interview, presents moments where our values, beliefs, and decisions are questioned. There will always be voices that try to diminish our experiences, that attempt to shame us for holding on to faith, tradition, or principles that have guided us for generations. But as Vance demonstrated, the key is not to fight fire with fire, but to meet hostility with calmness, to answer skepticism with truth, and to let integrity speak louder than accusations. Another powerful lesson from this exchange is the importance of growth and perspective. In today's world, changing one's mind is often seen as a weakness, as inconsistency. Yet wisdom is not about stubbornly clinging to past beliefs. It is about learning, evolving, and recognizing when experience offers a new understanding. Many older Americans know this firsthand. Life teaches us lessons that youth and ideology cannot. Vance's story is a reminder that it is not hypocritical to grow, it is necessary. Finally, this interview reaffirmed that respect is not earned by seeking approval from critics, but by staying true to one's convictions. As people age, they often see younger generations challenge long-held values, sometimes with ridicule or dismissal. But just as Vance stood firm in his beliefs despite Bennett's attacks, so too must we remain steadfast in our own principles. Strength is not about volume, it is about character, and dignity remains the most powerful response to arrogance.